So without further ado, the man, the myth, the legend, Dr. Roger Hall.
Thank you, Susie. I really can't follow that, but I do want to thank Susie for being the glue that puts all this together and holds it together, for all of her energy and everything. And thank you especially for coming. It would be kind of silly for me to be here without you, doing all of these things that we have going on tonight. And oh wait, it's better if I get this guy in here. Bring in the captain, and thank him, because as I was doing this, and if you're some of the students among the audience, I was telling you this week that I was kind of down to the wire on getting some of this done, and I wasn't quite sure because there's so many different things that he has done, and putting it all together in this short amount of time was kind of a challenge. And you know, this is the third of these three, but I think there's going to be more. Community Ed has asked me to do a program next fall. There's other things, I think, in the work. He's a person, I think, like you have in history, that while he's been acknowledged and recognized, I think sometimes it's good to have a refresher. And we may be at that point, as Susie says, with our 100th anniversary of the college coming up as well. So as I was working this week, this came to mind, and this is a World War I poster. And this is part of the propaganda about when the United States went into the war. And of course, you know, this is your moment in history, you know, make it. And I thought, well, that's absolutely me. I'm the one not making history. He made the history. I'm just reporting it. You know, if you can't do, then you teach. And so and I don't know, but I thought that, you know, about him, and it's with admiration. And because one thing I like about history is that the more you really get into something, the more you learn and realize there's yet another question. And I have several questions out of what I'm going to present tonight that I learned, but I couldn't sometimes completely answer. And so you get to. And since it is World War I thought I would just make a quick promo that in 2 weeks' time, we're going to have the fourth and last talk of this lecture series having nothing to do with Allan Hancock and everything to do with the end of World War I, which had, of course, it's on November 11th, is its 100th anniversary of the conclusion of that war, the fighting of the war on November 11th, 1918. And this is as close as we can get. So it's actually on the poster, but it's November 9th on a Friday, same kind of thing. I don't know if there's going to be wine, but there definitely will be candy. So I'll be doing that. And if you came 4 years ago to the series I did, it was a 3-part series on the beginning and the course of World War I. This is going to be different from that. And while I'm going to be dealing with basically the legacy of the war, a lot of that, as I'll explain, I want to look at the culture, at the art during the war, at the art after the war, at artists who were killed during the war, and it's just going to be a little different view. And I hope if you have any interest in either the war or events of the early 20th century, as I tell students in my recent U.S. class, I mean, this is a war with a very, very long, unfortunate legacy. And I hope you can join me on the 9th, because again, it would be silly for me if you're not here. So we'll be doing that in a couple weeks time. Of course, tonight is the last of the talks for now on this man. And what I usually do with the students is, why is the college named after him? And by the end of one lecture, we say, oh, okay, because of all the things he did. And in a sense, that's what it is. But had he not had the college named after him, his name wouldn't have been as well remembered. but he still did all those things. And I think it's kind of nice that there is a way to kind of focus what he accomplished and then the legacy of this institution. And again, he did not go to this school. He never taught at the school. He's not administrator of the school. He gave no money to this school. He did not give the land for this school, but he's well deserved in the school being named after him. And it was really an honor to do it for him, and I think a well-deserved honor as well. If you've been at either of the other two talks, you know, I talked about his rather interesting family, his grandfather on his mother's side, who started the first premium winery in California and did so many other things. Augustin Aristide, his mother, who, like her husband, although they didn't know each other, came across on the Oregon Trail to California at the gold rush. She was a child, but the mother, Ida is how you pronounce it, is a person who really is the one that made the wealth of the family more than anybody. Her husband Henry was an early prospector in the gold rush, 21 years older than her, so they didn't know each other at the time. And then a land surveyor in Los Angeles, and he had the good luck, good fortune, good guessing to buy a large rancho in what became central downtown Los Angeles in the 1860s. And it became enormously valuable, and underneath that land was oil, which he was mining as tar, but Ida is the one that pumped it out as crude oil and made a great deal of money. Allan Hancock had a twin who died in infancy, but a brother who, as I mentioned, talked about, who died sadly when he was only 16 of typhus. He had his own son who he named Bertram after his brother, and Bertram was killed in the Santa Barbara earthquake when he was only 22, at the point where he was just about to start to begin to kind of get into the business. Allan Hancock only had 2 children, 1 son, and he lost Bertram. Hancock, if you were here, was seriously injured in that earthquake at the Arlington Hotel, survived it, but essentially witnessed his son dying in a different section of the building as it collapsed. He had 3 wives. This was his first wife, who should be a little bigger, Genevieve, who he married in 1901 in Los Angeles, where he grew up. Genevieve died when she was 57 of cancer in 1936. He had a second wife, Helen, a marriage that didn't go well. That was kind of short, but it started off kind of romantic, but it ended by 1945. And as I was ending the last talk 2 weeks ago, that Hancock, in 1925, he's 50 years old. He's tremendously wealthy. He's quite accomplished with a lot of things in store for him, but he's a very prominent person in Southern California. He and his mother had made the money, first leasing land and then having their own oil company, and they were pumping out millions of gallons, 3-4 million gallons of oil a year through the 19-teens into the 1920s on Rancho La Brea that his father had purchased. He developed Hancock Park, which is a section of that rancho. He subdivided the land and built the houses. It's kind of a high-end, as it is today, land development that he did. He invested in Wilshire Boulevard, commercial and retail development, which runs right alongside Rancho La Brea, and worked out again very well for him. And then during the late 20s, throughout the 1930s, he was outfitting himself with some rather fabulous series of sailing vessels, 4 of them in total, and taking significant scientific expeditions to the Galapagos Islands, to the Sea of California, to southern or northern South America, with other scientists. And as I was saying, Allan Hancock is a person who seems to kind of wholeheartedly dive into his pursuits as he did. All during this time, he was giving of a lot of money to particularly University of Southern California, collectively about $7 million. Here he's being awarded, he was given a degree. He did not go to college, and he became a trustee of USC. And later in his life, was made a lifetime member of the trustees for all of his contributions. And this is just, if you were here, particularly the last talk, this is just a little bit of what he accomplished during this time. So as I was leaving it last time, why Santa Maria? You know, you're down there, you're in the best clubs, you're in the yacht club, you've got your holdings, your family's there, your roots are there. Why would you come here? This is Point Sal. As you see, Santa Maria Valley was homesteaded. I mean, you had Shumash, but if you talk about, white Americans, they came as homesteaders. The Homestead Act was started in 1862. Because frankly, and this will shock you, Santa Maria isn't the prime best place to do agriculture because, what's it lacking? Water. And of course, infrastructure before it has that. Benjamin Wiley is one of those early persons. You probably recognize the name, just like Joel Miller. And if you've ever been to Point Sal, this was one of the places where people like Wiley waited for wood, because that's another thing Santa Maria Valley doesn't have, is timber. If you've ever said, come visit and let's go to the forest in Santa Maria, I don't know where you're going. What they used to do was bring timber down by schooner from places like San Francisco, and there wasn't a pier at Point Sal. So they dropped the wood into the water and pushed it onto the shore, and then loaded it onto wagons. And if you've ever walked that road, which takes about 5 miles now from the trailhead to the beach, and you say, why is it so curvy? It's because it was for wagons and animals having to pull all that heavy timber up and to try and reduce the grade of the road as much as possible. It took 2 days to get a load of wood from the beach into Santa Maria Valley, which is why it was such a nice thing what Benjamin did for Joel Miller to give him that first load of wood that he had. So this was a kind of hard to develop place. I just put this in that the land we're on was also at one time homesteaded. I'm sure you recognize the tunnel name, but that was part of this area. Some of these people, like the tunnels, eventually left the land, went up into the Sisquoc because there was more water, found there were other problems, but it's not an easy place to develop, particularly for ranching or agriculture. It's a nice place in some respects, but for these early settlers, it was kind of tough. And without the Homestead Act giving very low-cost land to people, it probably would have taken even longer to develop. So like a house like that is all kind of imported wood. They could have put that if they were advertising it for sale. It's all imported. But the Santa Maria Valley is a hard place to develop. As you know, it was originally, of course, Central City, and then there's that Central City in Colorado, so it was a little confusing, so they changed the name to Santa Maria, just naming it after the mighty Santa Maria River. There's Joel Miller himself with some of that wood. Downtown Santa Maria, 1900. There's another reason I like history. If this was today, and that was my dog, somebody would be photographing it and putting it online and saying, loose dog running in the neighborhood, whose is it? And publicly shaming me. That's happened twice to me so far. I have a border collie, and she's like, well, if you don't pay attention to me for 30 seconds, I'll go exploring. These are the good old days when dogs could just roam free. But it's, you know, a little town here when Allan Hancock's 25 years old and living in Los Angeles, and at that point he's on the verge of making his fortune in oil. There are very few of those places left. If you go up into the Sisquoc, you know, there's hearths and maybe some you know, stones that are left. This is one of the few pioneer houses that are still around. You see, it was built in the 1870s by those English settlers, William and Sarah Smith, and then purchased by Joseph and Mary Enos. And you probably know, if you're in this area, that house is still around today. This is when it was still being used, but now it sits near the new development of Enos Ranch. And I just hope it gets preserved. I think there are some plans to do so, but just as part of our history, while it's not as deep as Eastern United States or a lot of things you'd find in Europe or some things you'd find in South America, it's our history. Well, we should preserve a little bit of it if we can. So I hope someone fixes up this house and opens it back up for maybe like what they've done with the Natural History Museum. But that's just one that has somehow survived all of this time. It's a little bit of early Santa Maria. Again, as it slowly grew, this was they were pretty significant, as you see, dry goods merchants. Sam Koblenz was French and Louis Schwabacher was German. They set aside their national differences, I assume, and they opened this in 1891, and they ran it till 1932 when they retired, and then closed their business. Yeah. Main Street in the 20s. And as I pointed out last time, Santa Maria had a population around 7,000 in the end of the 1920s. Certainly the biggest hotel would be the Santa Maria Inn in its various incarnations. And it was a stop for a lot of people between places when they were traveling. But again, I want to get to why would this man come up here? What was the draw to bring him to this area? If you go back to Los Angeles a little bit, Hancock, and this was something I didn't talk about in the previous couple of presentations, was an accomplished musician. His mother greatly encouraged him. This is a newspaper from 1913. You see the opening of the symphony. You're going to have to take my word for it. Allan Hancock's name is there. It's really hard to see, but he's listed there as one of a few cello players. Really, truly, believe me, I make up a lot of stuff, but that's true. He's there. You can obviously see there's a great sale on men's underwear, but this is something else. This is, of course, back in Los Angeles. Hancock's mother, Ida, apparently bought him a harmonica, and then moved up to a cornet, and finally a cello. And he apparently really took to it and loved to play, and really played throughout his life as much as he could. All kinds of situations that he got. I'd heard some people, well, you know, he's a wealthy man. He got into the LA Symphony, gave them money or something, but apparently he was quite good at playing. The college has some recordings, some records of his playing. He did a number of things. He played with the symphony, but he did a number of other things as well. I did mention that when he went on his sea voyages to the Galapagos, which would be 1 or 2 months at a time, he hoped to have some people who would travel on board who also played instruments so they could play. jam, as they would, as they were going down, and then do these kinds of presentations where they would talk about what they had learned and seen and filmed and play music for their audience at the same time. And Hancock will not stop playing at all when he moves to Santa Maria. He had, I believe it was 2 of these. That's not the one he had. That's just a replica. Not a replica. It is one of these. Gaglione? Gaglione? There you go. His apparently was built. This is a family of music makers, and so it's hard for me to kind of figure out which person in the family made his particular one, but I know that he kept it in a safe, locked up in his mother's house in Los Angeles. Here he is, kind of later in his life, with he supported lots of college symphonies. Gave considerable funds, attended all kinds of performances, and of course was doing a lot of performances himself during this time. When he was in his first years in Santa Maria, he got together, and William Strobridge, who worked with him, who was another musician, as you see, they met in a home, and they were doing a little playing around, and they talked about things, and Hancock apparently said, well, why don't we create a community orchestra? We'll have a fundraiser. Why is it called the high school? Because there's the high school. There was only the Santa Maria High School at the time. And this became the basis for what eventually became the Santa Maria Symphony. That this part was about the first 10 years, and Hancock participated in that. He later would found this Hancock Ensemble of string players, and for years they traveled up and down, it seemed, the west coast of the United States, into Canada, down into South America, giving performances to people. Hundreds of performances. That's about the cumulative total of performances that he gave. So this was not just a passing fancy. This was something he was very involved in and very committed to as he did a lot of his things. So the ensemble and the community orchestra and the symphony are all part of his foundation. And if you recall, I talked about the last time his second marriage and his wife complaining that he was gone a lot. She also complained that he would come home and just go practice his cello. So abandonment. I guess you could say. Now, this I knew nothing about until his great-granddaughter, who lives in San Luis, talked about it, and the college in their archives do have some newspapers stories. This is something that certainly have to learn more about, because these are the stories talking about the end of a case that I don't fully understand. But his great-granddaughter mentioned, because I asked her, why did he move to Santa Maria? And she said, well, it may have been the blackmail case. And blackmail case? Blackmail case? Apparently, perhaps, I don't know because it was dismissed, somebody wrote a letter to the family. You know, the family's very wealthy at this time. I mean, multi-millions. I don't know the details, but pay us $50,000 or face exposure of, I don't know, or your life. Wow, your money or your life. But then it was dismissed, and so I'm not quite sure. It may be kind of like what happened in the Galapagos with those strange couples and those people down there, and Hancock gets involved in this. Maybe this motivated him. He did seem to seek out a measure of privacy. I'm just not sure, but that's certainly something I'd want to look more into. It wouldn't surprise me, unfortunately, that a person of such prominence and wealth might be a target of some kind of, I don't know if it was extortion. If it's blackmail, I have yet to find out what would be the exposure part. I don't know what they would be finding. It does seem his first real connection to Santa Maria Valley came through the railroad, which he did not build. It was started here, as you see, pretty early, 1911. We need to haul some oil and asphalt from Rothamite to Guadalupe, this first train of Santa Maria. So what's your question? Exactly, thank you, exactly. Another one, what the heck is a Rothamite? It's a place. Rothamite, I guess. So I did some research. I didn't get to go on the tour, but the Friends of the Santa Maria Railroad give tours and apparently go out to the site of Rothamite. That's a map that's really of no use to you because it's not on there. But it does show Guadalupe, which is clearly one end of the railroad line, which connected to the main line. I believe Rothamite is somewhere near Cat Canyon, but I have to find out. And if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But as you see, it's long been abandoned. So I was trying to figure out where's this place, and all you get is, it used to be here, it's not here. But there apparently are some tours that they take out, and I don't know, by all their checking on maps, maybe they're not quite sure where it was. But anyways, he buys this short line, as it was, in 1925 for $75,000. The company had gone into bankruptcy. Their business had just kind of declined in the last few years. So Hancock, as he seemed to do, he bought it, and he had kind of a vision. Changed the name just slightly, became a licensed engineer so he could run the train, of course, because he wasn't going to just watch people do this. He was going to get involved. Did a lot of improvements, and all you need to go is down near the Paul Nelson, the Able Naudo Center, the Paul Nelson Pool, and see the roundhouse and the tracks and the rails and all those buildings, which are now being used for other things, were all part of the railroad operation and what he put in. He put in new tracks, improved the rail beds, and as you see, turned it into a profit-making enterprise, a very busy enterprise apparently, hauling sugar beets and oil and then crops out of the valley. So you just take it that important 15 miles to Guadalupe to connect to the main line, and then farmers, of course, have a way to get things to the market. So, does anybody know what Betaravia means? Dang you. Because I didn't know that this morning. Well, good for you. Susie, let's have another drawing and give more packages away. Very good. Now it's French, but it's sugar beets. And of course, there are many different products that are coming out of the valley, but getting them to market is one. This is one way to do it, by wagon and 14 horses hauling kind of messy loads of sugar beets. But wouldn't it be so much better if you had a train? You could carry so much more, so much faster. And so that would be one of the services, of course, the railroad is going to provide and displace these animals so they can go, to pasture and have fun and whatever horses do. So the Santa Maria Valley Railroad office is still there down on Jones Street across from where the old Coca-Cola plant used to be. The plants have grown up. The railroad is not there now, the business. The railroad's still around, but it was sold in 2006. There's other entities. I think there's a charter school, and I forget what else is in there. But oil was another big thing that they moved. And there's, of course, Hancock on his steam engine 21, which he is one of several locomotives that he purchased during this time. He must have had an affection, or they were just useful, because he used these steam engines for a very long time. Even after he started buying the more modern diesel engines, he kept using them. And I was told, and I think this would be great, that he used to, or at least once, have contests where he had a steam engine and a diesel engine have essentially a tug of war. down on the tracks. And I don't know what they pulled, but it's like a tractor pull sounds kind of thing. And that just sounds great. Finally, though, he retired his engine number 20, which was one of his original engines from when he bought the railroad in 1962. Now, here's Allan Hancock. You recognize anybody else? Walt Disney. Walt Disney was a great friend of Allan Hancock's and also loved steam engines. And so he was there as well. There's Walt. He had lots and lots of engines. He's a very large man. Didn't realize. So he was invited by Allan to come to the retiring of Engine 21, come to Santa Maria, and I think that's what really brought out the crowds, was maybe he's signing autographs. Disney is there at the top there, but putting this beloved engine to its end, although it still exists, it's not in service anymore. You can go down to Los Angeles to Griffith Park, and there's this train collection, train museum, and there's Engine 21, along with a couple of other things. I was coming up from south of Los Angeles last weekend, thinking about this talk, thinking absolutely need to stop at Griffith Park, looked at the traffic and everything. The heck with that, I'll just get pictures offline. I'll get there. But anyways, he did want those preserved. And that seems to be something about Allan Hancock. He got into things seriously, but he also seemed to want to, like La Brea, he wanted to have preservation and continuation. And even this, just don't send it to the scrap heap, but have it out there at least for potential use. The railroad, just to point out, does still run today. Its offices are really a little farther west of Santa Maria. I don't know if Allan would approve of the graffiti today, but I was at a train museum, and I don't know if this is true, but they said that railroads are not really unhappy about the graffiti as long as it doesn't cover important markings, because the paint helps preserve the cars. I don't know if that's intensive rationalizing, but that's what they said. But anyways, you do still have the Santa Maria Valley Railroad, but the Hancock family is no longer a part of it as it was for over 70 years during this time. At the same time, like so many things with him, when he bought the railroad, the next year he started the first radio station in all of the county. And he put its studio inside the railroad building. He converted one room to a studio. And I'd point out that the first commercial radio station in the United States had just gone on the air 6 years before. And here's this guy, hey, why don't we do that? And so we had radio service in the mid-1920s. Those are just some early sets and I don't know who that is. Let's call her Florence. But he brought radio service to the county a lot earlier than a number of other places. So we all know about the flight school, and I just want to remind you how early this is in flight. So here's your first flight in the history of humanity, and Kitty Hawk in 1903, all of 12 seconds long. They went about 6 miles an hour. You could just kind of run alongside the plane as Wilbur did during that time. And very quickly they went a little bit farther. But 1903, you finally get off the ground. I mean, so for years, just taking off a plane, and it still kind of draws a crowd, but just taking a plane off, a big crowd might gather. And this is nobody connected with this talk, but just somewhere in Washington, D.C. But it's funny, sometimes when amazing technology is created, what do we do with it? And there really wasn't a purpose for planes once they got in the air, because they weren't strong enough to carry anybody, more than 1 or 2 people. So what do you do with this amazing invention? And it became a novelty for a number of years. You do stuff like this, you know. We'll just have entertainment. Well, you know, and then it becomes, I think, a one-upsmanship, you know. Well, I'll climb up a pole while the plane is mid-flight. Well, I'll hang off. Well, let's say with one arm instead of two. Well, I'll be blindfolded then as I get on the plane and wing walk and all the kind of stuff I would never do. Can we top this kind of thing? Sure we can. Can play tennis. Hey, would you be the ball boy? Jeez. This is the kind of stuff going on in the 1920s, just a novelty. Because, I mean, while planes play a role, unfortunately, in World War I, they still don't have a commercial purpose. It's just strange how sometimes it takes a while for things to take place. But in the 1920s happens one of the most significant moments in early aviation with Charles Lindbergh on the East Coast flying across the Atlantic. People had done that in 1913. Lindbergh was nowhere. There had been actually a few dozen people who'd flown across the Atlantic, but nobody had ever done it by himself. And so this was something just kind of remarkable. And Lindbergh becomes kind of this modern sort of frontiersman. So let's take a little look what's going on here. That may not be the right film. I'm not sure. It's not the right film. But the point is, it's a joke. But the point is, at this, you're going, was that Lindbergh? That in this day, and I just wanted to remind you, at this time of early flight, this was the kind of stuff people were imagining as to what you could do. These were a few years before Lindbergh and the Wright brothers, and as you see, the theme seems to be mimicking birds. If they fly, then that's how we're going to fly. Now, I think any of us could look at this and say, that's never going to get off the ground. It's going to crash exactly like that. What the? Okay, it's going a little slow, Bob. What the heck? Make it bigger. But this is the world that you're at. And this is, you know, if you recall Allan Hancock having the second car in Los Angeles, I mean, really it was a carriage with a stick and a motor. And you could call it a car. I know. I know. It's good exercise. Oh, he's going to fall. He's going to fall down. I know it. Yeah. You could just, but just from, wow. Just remember, as humorous as these are, they didn't create them for that purpose. They were serious. They really thought there were actually casualties in some of these things they did. So here's 1927. You've actually got a guy flying over 3,000 miles across an ocean. That's amazing how you could do that. And Lindbergh rightly becomes this incredible hero. There's a control panel of his plane. There's no automatic pilot. He couldn't even see out of the front of his plane because they had so filled it with fuel. They had used containers there. He had to use a kind of a little, it's kind of hard to see, but he has almost like a periscope to see around the edge, just to watch where he's kind of going. How he got there is just incredible. I can barely get home. And so, you know, if you go to the Air and Space Museum, one of the first things you'd see is the Spirit of St. Louis, because of, and usually next to it is, or down below it is the Apollo 11 moon capsule, because these are two monumental achievements. This enormous parade given to him, that President Calvin Coolidge sent a destroyer across the Atlantic to bring Lindbergh home. Wow, 1927. What about the Pacific? Let's see if we can get somebody across there. And this is the plane that's going to do it just the next year. It's not nonstop, which I think is one reason it doesn't get the same attention as Lindbergh. It's not with one person. Okay, but it's still highly risky and amazing thing. And this is actually a surplus plane that had crashed, that was reconditioned, that was used. And Allan Hancock plays the key role in this happening, because this plane, which had a different name, as you see, was being used in Alaska and crashed. And these two Australians, Charles Kingsford Smith and Charles Ulm, who had this idea of being the ones to maybe cross the Pacific, but they didn't have much money, bought this plane, which had no engine or instruments, and then they tried to, well, today we'd say, you know, GoFund or something, Kickstart, and we get some money. They had a couple of people interested, and they withdrew. The Australian government had an interest, and then they withdrew. They got no money. In comes Allan Hancock. He met them through a business associate. He took them down to Mazatlan on his ship at the time, which was the Oaxaca. He spent some time with them. He liked them, and he said, essentially, in some words, that he would do this for them. So he took the plane, he reconditioned it, he outfitted it, he bought the engines. He, of course, instrument panel is important. Got all that stuff put in. There, of course, is Hancock, and then he paid for what the costs were to take this venture. So it's going to be a crew, and they're of course going to have two stops along the way. Fiji was one of them as they made their way to Australia, and it's still, of course, very risky. Hancock doesn't fly this plane. He did fly this plane, but not across the Pacific. And he didn't talk about it at first, and then the word came out, hey, there's this guy from Santa Maria that's planning to send a plane across the Pacific, and this is in the Lompoc Review, and it kind of talks about how he'd met them and been on his boat, the Oaxaca. So there he is with the pilot, Kingsford Smith, and the co-pilot, just before they do takeoff. Now, this is just a little thing from me. I've been saying, if you've been at the other two talks, I've never seen a picture of Allan Hancock smiling with his teeth. There he is. I know it's a side angle, but he's clearly smiling. So I can check that off my bucket list, and I can sleep well tonight. I found a picture of Allan Hancock smiling. So, I mean, with his, even though he's not looking, he seems pretty happy. So they're going to begin their journey. They were leaving out of Oakland to go across. So there's the crew in the dark shirts with some other people, and as you see, they're going to take a little while to get there. Now this really is them. This isn't a joke. This is one. But I want to show you this first clip because this is the Southern Cross not on its transatlantic flight or trans-Pacific, but on a different flight, and just the difficulties of what it was like to travel at this time.
Smithee told of the plans. They were trying on this occasion a little bit really on account of the fact that two machines for the first time in this part of the world will be doing an ocean flight in formation. There's the dear old Southern Cross, as you all know so well, in command of yours truly, and the Faith of Australia, an equally well-known machine under the command of my old friend Captain Bill Taylor.
Each plane was loaded with 600 gallons of fuel, enough to run the engines continuously for 21 hours at about 100 miles an hour. The second stage of the drama began when one of the navigators became ill, and Smithee was forced to load all of the mail onto the Southern Cross. Bill Taylor was thus released to act as navigator to his old companion. The third phase occurred 400 miles out to sea, when a portion of the plane's exhaust carried away, shattering the starboard propeller and forcing Smithee to turn for home. Mail, cargo, and surplus petrol were dumped to lighten the load. A reenactment later demonstrated the courage of the crew that made possible their safe return. With the damaged propeller out of action, the port engine soon began to show signs of strain, and somehow more oil had to be got to it. These pictures show how Bill Taylor accomplished the feat. Climbing out on the tiny strut, he drained the oil from the damaged motor into a thermos flask, passing it back through the window to where it was emptied into a suitcase, before transfer to the overheated engine. Oil spilled in the operation splashed down the fuselage.
Bill, we need you to go out onto the strut. Here's a thermos. We got a suitcase here. Amazing that this actually worked. But this is the kind of stuff that could and did happen. And of course, when you're crossing bodies of water, if things don't go right, then it's just catastrophe. So they were able to land this plane safely. This is the same crew that flies across during the big flight in the reconditioned plane that Hancock has provided for them. So they made that, and then they do the big journey. And this is a newsreel from the time of their completion. Edit this out, Kevin. Ford, Dodge, Chevy. Dang it. Which one is it? Oh, Chevy.
I want to take advantage of this opportunity to say hello to you and also to, in public, congratulate the boys on putting up a marvelous show. Cheerio, fellas. Fine show. Cheerio, Pep. Cheerio, Johnny.
Kind of a different world, just sort of, it was sort of like Lindbergh, kind of humble and self-effacing and cheerio. I forgot to tell you he was going to speak Australian, so I didn't know if you follow all of that. But the whole thing wouldn't have happened if Allan Hancock hadn't stepped in. In 2 years' time, they brought the Southern Cross to Santa Maria on display. Hancock gave Kingsford Smith the airplane and as kind of thanks for what he'd accomplished. Kingsford Smith later gave the plane back to Hancock, sort of, well, I can out-generous you. And later, there'd be a film made about him, Smithee, his nickname, and this kind of daring do things. Unfortunately, That was 1928 when they did the flight. He was lost at sea in 1935 on another plane that was, they'd also named it a version of the Southern Cross, and something happened and he was not recovered. You know, Amelia Earhart disappeared on her attempt to fly around the world in the same time period in the mid-30s. I mean, it's a risky enterprise, certainly. I'd like to say I went to Brisbane to take this picture just for tonight, but it is at the Brisbane International Airport. They built a special area for it, and so the plane is on display there. And I mean, it's as significant as the Spirit of St. Louis in its own right. And so that's where it ended up when Kingsford Smith gave it back to Hancock. He eventually gave it to the government of Australia, and then they finally took care of it. It apparently was that expedition that got Hancock interested more in flying, not just myself, but let's kind of have a flight school. And of course, the College of Aeronautics would come out of that in the same year. So Hancock has decided that he wants to build a flight school here, which would be certainly preferable to Los Angeles with all of Santa Maria's fairly empty land areas. And so we're going to have this basically booster for this new aviation industry, which still doesn't have a whole purpose, but nonetheless we're going to go ahead and do this. And as you see, a pioneering effort is being noted here. So in 1928, they start to build these hangars and bring in these first planes, these Waco 10 OX-5 biplanes. Oh, good, because I thought somebody would be interested. That's not correct, because I don't know what these kind of planes are. But that's what they supposedly are. I think there's that, and I was just wondering if my information, I think, is correct. So training planes, pilot planes for people. They would, you know, as we recently have a flight show, just planes going off in the air. Santa Maria's never had planes. They don't have an airport. It's a dirt runway, but now they've got a flight college that began classes in May of 1928. Hancock, of course, was a pilot and partook in these activities, flew with Kingsford Smith and flew on his own, had his own plane, this three-engined one, and off they go. Whoever wants to be a pilot can sign up for this work. No. This was a hard school. This was a tough school, this College of Aeronautics. And a lot of people did not pass. In fact, in the beginning, most people did not pass. And Don, are you here? Oh, there you are. Yeah. Your father was one of the 8 people, this is Don Goodman here, who was in the first class, and these are documents that you were so nice to share with the college and me about him and his time in Santa Maria as one of this first class. As you see, it was difficult to get through. The school would be dinged by the state today if we had such a low graduation rate. But Don Goodman was one of those 8 people that made it through. You see him there standing on one of the planes. He didn't have a lot of money. He was really worried about some of the things that he had to do for this. Let me just point out a few things that he wrote some things down over his life here about what he had to do. He said, you know, Allan Hancock, Captain Hancock, as he says, converted part of his ranch holdings on the edge of town into a one-runway airport, built the hangars along these things. Our ground school consisted of courses in aerodynamics, physics, mathematics, aerial navigation, celestial navigation, engine and airplane mechanics, meteorology, radio communications, 200 hours of flying, 20 hours of blind flying instrument only, practice, and eventually graduating with ratings in all of those categories. So you could see why it was very difficult. He was particularly worried about trigonometry, which he had to take. He had never taken trigonometry. He was kind of amazed that he actually got through. But it was very difficult to do. It took 2 years for him to get his, all of his requirements done. As you see, he was an A student by our measurements today with a 93 average at the final. I think that could be our slogan for the college. Yes?
Parachutes.
Parachute.
To jump out. Want to try it?
That'd be my guess. What does it mean if you got an 89? No, I don't know. I would assume that's actually, I don't know if they did that. Do you know? I don't know. You know, as we always say in teaching, a good question's one you can't answer. So I don't know that. But as you see, there was this was his graduation certificate with all of these things and his percentages and what he did, cooperation, he's pretty discipline, initiative, reliability. I mean, they had a pretty thorough look, along with, of course, his course record and those 200 hours that were required to do this. So you could see why so many people didn't make it through. At the same time, a commercial airline started in Santa Maria in the 1930s, which, what really grates me is it went to more places than the airports go today. You could take a little trip. They would fly you to San Luis Obispo and wait for an hour. And then fly you back home for $15, which would be a lot of money in the 1930s, but wouldn't that be better? They had overnight charges, the baggage limit, of course, just like now. But they flew to a number of places, and you see, depending on the plane, the cost for it. So some is sightseeing, some is kind of tourism, some would be more practical, maybe business-minded or things of that nature. But how the two things go along, the flight school, and it would be natural that then you would, with a runway, you would start an airline, that kind of thing. But then, just a year after the flight school opens, the Depression begins, the country bottoms out. For the next 4 years, the economy gets worse and worse all around the country. California's unemployment rate's about 24%. Which is about the national average. It's worse in some places, a little better in others. And the flight school enrollment is okay, but the demand for pilots just tanks. And Hancock will actually close the college for 4 years. There's just no reason to turn out. It'd be like turning out Ph.D. history majors. What's the point? So as you see, he closed the college until things improved. Unfortunately, as the 30s came closer to a close, there was more impending problems, it appeared, in Europe and maybe in Asia. And so he reopens his college. And then September 1st, the Second World War begins. And then 2 years later, Pearl Harbor is attacked by Japan. And in a relatively short time, the United States has a global conflict in 2 continents and 2 oceans, and it needs everything. 16 million people will go into the service in total for the United States during this time. And Hancock's college is perfectly situated. Probably because of its rigor, it's one of a few that are picked across the country to train military pilots. They simply didn't have the capacity, or they wanted more capacity to train pilots. So his private civilian flight school was picked to turn out what turned out to be over 8,400 cadets in the next few years. So lots of people came to Santa Maria to be in the flight school. I'm sure many of them left. I'm sure some of them stayed. And all of this goes on during this time. More structures were built. The airfield was expanded. Now they have 3 runways, those little dotted areas there. And if you know where Miller School is, and you can kind of see Boone Street, this is a pretty large area, kind of between Stoll and Maine, and sort of like between Miller and Bradley, and then all the housing and things that you'd need in between it. So lots, and of course, this is what ends the Depression in the United States, where all these needs and jobs that the war created. So there's a whole series of planes and different types of planes, and many more of them that came in during this time. And frankly, I'm sure there's people in the audience who know more about this than I do. But there's just a lot of this going on. But the rigor was kept. There's an incoming person is having his eyes examined, and it's really run on a pretty strict discipline, kind of military style. It was men only that were allowed to be applicants here. One of the classrooms. I have never had a classroom where people all sit up like that. Let alone they're not doing this. It's just really odd. So strange. Here they are in their mess hall. As Goodman recounts, lights went out promptly at 10 o'clock. Day started usually around 6:30. I mean, and this was an intensive thing. And I imagine during the war it wasn't really any different, if not more. So for this. So the goal was to get your Hancock College aeronautics certificate. You got this when you did your first complete, as it says, unassisted alone solo flight. That was quite an accomplishment. Mr. Goodman, although I believe the Santa Maria Historical Society is interested in putting together a book on his life, he's one of these persons I really did start here and fly anywhere. And he stayed in aviation for some years, was in many different areas, ended up in Alaska, and created an airline that became the basis later on for Alaska Airlines. And it all started right here. So, there's quite a bit. That's a little yearbook that they had that somebody defaced the H. Yeah.
So it's 200 hours for the completion of the course.
Flight time, yeah.
And do you know roughly what was the number of hours before first solo flight?
I don't. I'm 0 for 2.
The report said 36 dual hours.
Dual hours? Yeah. Dom is going to bring that certificate back in a form for his engineering students, right? You're going to modify that? That's great. Use the logo that was created for the flight school. I think students will love that kind of thing, having that. Dom DeBello is one of our faculty here. Hancock was awarded this for his, he got a number of acclaim, but this was, as you see, the highest award that the Air Force has for a non-Air Force member because of his contribution. He will get a letter of merit from Harry Truman later on because the flight school goes into the 1950s and continues to train people for the Korean War. It trained mechanics and others. It literally put Santa Maria on the map because they had to mark then it had an airport as it now has. So the Santa Maria Public Airport is known also as the Captain G. Allan Hancock Field and Mailbox. And but so there it is. And this is all. So of course this land was part of the flight school. At the end of the war, Allan Hancock married for the third and final time. You recall his first wife passed, and his second wife was a short, relatively unhappy marriage. He marries Marion Mullen, who was considerably younger than him, but he had known her for a great deal of number of years. And what I was told by his great-granddaughter is that she had worked and been around him, worked in his office for a long time, that she said it wasn't very romantic. He kind of came to her and said, "We know each other, we know what we're getting, let's get married." Something of those things. Okay, so they got married at Santa Ynez Mission. and that would be his wife. Now he's 71 when they marry, and so she will say later, I had a hard time keeping up with him. He just was still doing this, doing that. You'll read stories, newspaper clippings that they'll say he's in retirement in Santa Maria. Doesn't seem like it, as best as I can tell. The flight school goes to, as you see, into the 1950s, and then parts of it, and then finally the entire thing's closed by the end of the 50s. And of course, it's Hancock again. And as you know, across College Avenue, some of those buildings are still being used. Today, I take my car to a mechanic who works in one of those buildings. They have long lives. And there is some footage here. I'm just in the interest of time, I'm not going to show it now. It's just more of the flight school. It's silent footage. But we're starting to collect a little more footage than what we had just a month ago. At the same time, so he's got railroads, and he's got the Southern Cross, and he's got this flight school, but he starts a farm, which he names after his one child who's remaining since Bertram died. Rosemary is seen as an adult here with her one child, Patricia. It was a farm. If you've heard of Rosemary Farms, you probably associate it with eggs because that's what they sell today. Apparently, they have no connection with the Hancock family. They just kept the name. But it was what was more common at that time, a farm with cattle and alfalfa and corn and a lot of different products. Eggs, chickens were added later. You can see, of course, a large number of them there. The sign, this is only about a mile from here at most. The Rosemary Farms out on Sway Road is still there, although it's not it's used, the buildings are used as housing for farm workers. Allan Hancock's house is still there. Someone occupies it. The sign, though, that says Rosemary Farms is still there, and you could go by it. Hancock, as you see, started small, got much larger, eventually quite large. And as he typically did, brought a lot of things to bear on his farm in this case. I've read things that, well, he really brought row crops to Santa Maria. He did some experimenting with things. He just kept building and experimenting and developing throughout this area, and of course getting larger areas. Even with the chickens, there was some kind of cutting edge technology. Now Rosemary Farms points out that they draw their eggs from a whole series of small growers, and there are free range chickens, and it's a different deal than how Hancock did it. But these were things that he had during his time. He did not farm himself. He personally didn't, and he's also off in the Galapagos a lot of these years. Of course, Rosemary Packing Corporation, he built these packing sheds on his property, also the ice and cold storage, which he used, others could use. And hey, I've got a railroad. You can ship your carrots in. So it all worked out. It's kind of like what he was doing in Los Angeles in developing things and then finding ways for others to profit while it would also be beneficial for him. There he is on a tractor. The Hancock brand and the cattle brand they had. And as you see, the farm gets pretty large. Where the hedges are in the front, that's where the sign would be. And his house, which seems kind of modest, is on the right-hand side, kind of a row of structures there. Most of those buildings in the back aren't there anymore. It's just the housing that's been left. His great-granddaughter, though, had a photo album of all the interiors of the house, which I thought was kind of interesting because a lot of it doesn't exist anymore. But since she knew her great-grandfather, she was there, and oh yeah, I remember this, I remember that. The backyard. Yeah. This was her favorite place. the pool. It's now filled in. There's not a pool there anymore. You see it was covered. And it's just another shot of it all. But they had every room, every area, it seemed, of the house photographed at some point. I don't know, late 50s, probably somewhere in that time period, kind of judging by the furnishings in the living room. Now, her great-grandfather was elderly, and so they had certain rules. They were not supposed to run in the house, and they were make sure they didn't run into him and push him, and some places, you know, got to stay out of the dining room. She has this glassware, though. Some of these things have, and these were things. Some of this goes back to Ida, his mother, having it, and she has this set of glassware at her home. And she took one of these glasses and handed it to me, and I quickly gave it back. Oh, that's lovely, because I don't. That guy came and he busted one of these. But it's very, very thin, and if you, I don't know, and if you can see, it's got a very unusual design to it all. It's kind of a press glass, but just parts of the. She doesn't have any of the table settings. I'm not sure what happened to all that. They didn't live like Lucy and Ricky. This was a guest bedroom that you had. This was Hancock's bedroom. And I would assume if we could see closer, those look like maybe commendations, perhaps, for some, maybe some art. I was trying to look and see if there's, it's hard to see. There's obviously a picture of him on the wall on the left. I was trying to make out what all this is. Now maybe it's for the photographs, or maybe it's just always just kind of everything's squared and neat. It's not like my house at all. This is the best part, I think, his movie theater. And it's a movie theater. Red velvet, everything. I think, is it 18 seats? So he would watch movies. He was a politically conservative. I got a hold of some of his films. They were mostly anti-communist films made in the 1950s. He was an ardent anti-communist, gave speeches about the mad bear of Russia and how we had to, watch for them and all. But he watched other things. And as I mentioned a couple of lectures ago, we're hoping to get a trove of some other films that has been held by his trust. There's, of course, a view of the screen with more velvet. So that'd be kind of fun. Jane Ann, his great-granddaughter, was about 10 when he died, so I can imagine her as a little kid getting to go to the movies at her grandfather's house. He also had a very elaborate train set that took up a whole room, and she doesn't know what's happened to the train, but that's there's some footage of the train there. And the gardens that some people remember that Marion seemed to tend to, I'm sure with some help, that were rather extensive that they had here. So it's much nicer than I ever imagined. If you went out and looked at it today, you would see almost none of this. You'd see the house and you just wouldn't see any of all this. It's just been let go over the time. So as you see, Santa Maria, while it may seem small, is growing considerably during this time, doubles its population in the 1950s, requiring now a policeman to stop traffic. No light still, it seems. And of course the population is going to continue to grow. There it is in 1945 at the end of the war. That's all of Santa Maria. You can see the Santa Maria River bed. I'm not sure where exactly all those streets are. I think I can kind of make out Maine. I'm not sure what's on this. I don't know if that's where. Anyways, there's basically Santa Maria, and that large light-colored area is the flight college. In the early 60s, you can see how much growth there's been, and the city is just spreading out relative to what it had been. And so you've got this other issue of, inadequate education. Obviously, you can build more high schools, but the community college, which had started in 1920, inside the Santa Maria High School, is fast outgrowing itself. So there's the 1929 entire faculty on the top and the entire student, or at least those who showed up for the picture in the class of 1929. If you came to graduation last year, over 1,000 people graduated for the first time. We have about 162 full-time faculty and about 350 part-time faculty, and there's around 10,000 students. I thought this was interesting. Their yearbook, they had people just sign their names. They didn't say, oh, like, you know, have a cool summer, stay sweet, see you in the fall, or, you know, draw something obscene or something like that. They just sign their names. But so the college is really outgrowing the high school. And already in the 1950s, it seems around 53, 54, there was this interchange of names between Santa Maria Junior College and Allan Hancock College. And I haven't been able to pin it down, but it's a little earlier than I thought. You see a lot of newspaper stories there. But in 1960, a bond is passed. We have a bond coming up. And there's Allan Hancock with of course, Ernest Righetti, who has the high school named after him, given the ceremonial shovel to start this new college for Santa Maria. Also at this groundbreaking was Walter Conrad, who was president of the college at the time. I forget his name, but his last name's Waller. He was there. There's a number of people you'd recognize their names. And so Hancock now, he's 85, and but still out there doing things, and they're going to build this school. 2 years later, the beginning of the junior college on the portion of Hancock Field. So that's how the college ends up where it is, and you can see the gym is in the foreground. No charge for parking is my assumption. And I know, and there's the track, which is now in a different location, some of these buildings. We were trying to figure this out the other day. Did we ever figure this out? I'm thinking this is the student center. That's what I'm guessing because of the sign in the elevated building, and that part's been done. It's now the Rabobank Student Center. So, $1 million. We'll get to that. And then officially the next year they name it, it's just completely dedicated, and now the name change of the Allan Hancock Joint Junior Community College, and of course he and Marion are there as the recipients. So it's for all the things he did. I defy you to find anybody in the history of Santa Maria who did as much as Allan Hancock, who did as much for Santa Maria as Allan Hancock, let alone all the other things that he did for Southern California, for education in general. And, I think you make a pretty good case for him. Here's just a couple of examples. 1965, so you got the college named after you. You're in your 80s. Well, let's give 10 acres of land to the local hospital, which they had originally given some money to earlier, and build a new hospital on that 10 acres of land, which opens, as you see, a couple years later. It's terribly unclear, although I think it's becoming more clear, if Marion Hancock is the person that the hospital's named after. I'm starting to lean yes. I've heard people say no, but I'm starting to think from other information that it might be yes. They are prominent Catholic people. They had a lot of connections with the Catholic Church. They gave a lot of money. His mother gave a lot of money to the Catholic Church. Marion Hancock was a philanthropist in her own right. Did a lot of different things, and this was certainly a significant contribution. Of course, now the hospital has had the new hospital built since then, but this was a big step up. Even later in his life, This is before, you really have, a whole lot of educational, I mean, it's around, but here he is, well, I will fund a educational television station in Los Angeles. This would be something good for, I said 77, that's not correct. He's not alive. It's 67, 57. Oh, it was getting late. It was late. That's what's so remarkable about it. Forget the date. Forget the date. But he did, the other part's true. The other part's correct. He did found the first education station, paid for the license, paid for the studio space in Los Angeles. When was that year? I just wasn't thinking. Because it was before PBS, which was in the mid-60s, that he did this. So, around this, it was between the college and before then. And so he just kept going with these things as he went. If we have a captain's room, we have a board room on the college, and it's named after him, the captain's room. And there's pictures like this. There's paintings, portraits, and things. But I don't think this is really what he would have. I think this is what Allan Hancock loved to do. Here he is, more in his prime on the Valero 3, that magnificent of his 4 ships on the deck, maybe thinking or heading out to the Galapagos on a 2-month journey. I'm going with scientists. We're going to be dredging the sea bottom. We're going to be playing music we're going to be meeting those strange people down there in the Galapagos. I think that's really Allan Hancock, and what he liked was he's a person that really was just, as I said a few lectures ago, he took his wealth and it gave him a great freedom, but he did some pretty significant things for himself and for others. He is buried in Los Angeles, where his father had settled the family with the rancho. He's buried next to his father in this mausoleum, family crest there. Sort of, there's the ship, and there's a microscope for science, and there's the grapes for his father, and there's a plow and a wagon, which his father coming across the country. So it's a mix, and there's old derricks. It's kind of an appropriate memory of him and what his family accomplished. It's hard to make out the letters in there. But as I started this all off, he did this, he did this, he did this, and there's so much more that he did that, I really considering, even though I don't want to say it'd be me, but that somebody ought to write a book about him, and I'm kind of thinking I'm getting more material to do something on that line as we go. So off he goes. There he goes. So yeah. One last thing. I don't know where to put it, so I put it at the end. Jim Morrow, who's in the audience, some years ago put me in contact with Larry Villegas, who was a butcher in town at Williams Brothers, and knew Allan Hancock, and so I got to talk to him about it. And I want to know about his personality, about this and that. How did he dress when he came to the market? What did he like? And Larry Villegas, who's unfortunately no longer with us, said that his favorite food was Welsh rarebit. And I kept thinking him saying rabbit. His rabbit. He liked eating rabbit. Rarebit, rabbit, rarebit, rabbit. And I didn't get it. Welsh rarebit, which is cheddar cheese on bread. And I don't know where to put it, but I would say, okay, I want to honor Larry and say, that's Allan Hancock's favorite food. And he said he would order these huge, expensive rounds of cheddar from England. He didn't care what it cost. He wanted to have this particular type of cheddar for his rarebit. So if you want to make rarebit, you can honor Allan Hancock. So that's all.